Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Rabbi Julia Andelman, Director of Community Engagement at JTS, and I'm so happy you've joined us today for this session of our summer learning series, JTS Alumni in the World, Scholarship and Impact. A special welcome to anyone who may be joining us for the first time today, and for everyone else, or really for all of you, I hope you had a lovely 4th of July for those in the States, and hopefully a little time off to focus even more on the craziness of our world. That's kind of what it was like for me. But anyway, I hope you felt a relaxing, extra long weekend. We're so pleased to be featuring this summer, not our faculty, as we have been for the last several years in this series, but our alumni doing really fascinating, interesting work largely in academia. But academia that we can relate to, as opposed to kind of the more esoteric sphere. So we're very pleased to have today Dr. Leah Garrett, who is a graduate of the Kekst Graduate School. She is Larry A. and Klara Silverstein Chair in Jewish Studies and Director of Hebrew and Jewish Studies at Hunter College here in New York, City University of New York. And her session today is called X-Troop, the Secret Jewish Commandos Who Helped Defeat the Nazis, which is also the title of her book. So we're happy to have you here today, Dr. Garrett, to share what you found in your research, and which led to the creation of this very fascinating sounding book. I also wanted to make a quick announcement before I turn things over to Tani. Actually, a personal announcement today, which is that I just want folks to know that after, since we've been doing this learning together, some of us for 4.5 years now, since April 2020, that I'm actually going to be leaving JTS soon. Today is my penultimate time with you, and next Monday, a week from now, will be my last time facilitating this series. So I'll say a little bit more then, but just wanted to give you a quick heads up about that. Tani will continue to organize this series as she has been doing so expertly for so long. And Ellie Gettinger, who you've seen before, times when I haven't been able to facilitate on Mondays, will be facilitating most of the rest of the series, and you'll have wonderful folks for you going on in the fall. But just wanted to say, just to give you that heads up and just say how really meaningful and wonderful and enjoyable this series has been for me to facilitate. So I will say a little bit more next week, but just wanted to again alert you so I'm not dropping any bombs, and that's so not any pun intended, because the session is about World War II. All right, on that note, I'm going to turn it over to Tani for some announcements.
Thank you, Rabbi Andelman. So just to go over the format for our session, Dr. Garrett will pause for questions periodically throughout the class. We'll have some time for Q&A at the end as well. Please use the chat feature to submit your questions to Rabbi Julia Andelman during the Q&A period. Rabbi Andelman will select a few of the questions to present to Dr. Garrett. Since we receive a lot of questions, kindly express your question both clearly, in complete sentences, and also concisely. For any technical or logistical questions, please initiate a private chat with either myself or Ellie Gettinger. We'll be screen sharing a PowerPoint presentation during today's session. So please introduce Dr. Leah Garrett, Larry A. and Klara Silverstein Chair and Director of Jewish Studies at Hunter College, CUNY. She received her PhD with distinction from JTS, and Leah has published 5 books, including her most recent, X-Troop, the Secret Jewish Commandos of World War II, which we'll be hearing about during today's session. And I'm so pleased to turn it over to Dr. Garrett.
Hi, everyone. I hope you can hear me. So I think I've probably done about 40 talks or so about X-Troop, and some just rise to the occasion of me being very excited, and it's very exciting for me to be back at JTS here today. I got an incredible education at JTS. I did a master's in modern Jewish studies, and then I did my PhD with all the greats, with David Roskies and with David Fishman and with Jack Wertheimer. and I only ever have great things to say about JTS. And so I'm very glad to be here today. I'm going to be talking about a virtually unknown commando unit of Jews today. And the way I'm going to talk about the structure is I'm going to first give a historical background, because no one had really written about this till I wrote this book, which came out a couple of years ago. It's now been translated into Hebrew and all sorts of other languages. And recently I gave a talk at the War College. Sorry, I'm getting all these notices while I'm talking from you. Okay, so War College in Pennsylvania with all these top military leaders in the United States. So it was incredible because they're starting to hear the story of X Troop. The British military is starting to talk about the story of X Troop. And my guess is that this story will be quite surprising to most people. So I want to give you a full historical background. I'm going to take a break partway through to take questions, and I love questions. I'm going to then wrap up the historical section, taking more questions. And then the last third, I want to talk about the process of writing this book, doing the archival research, interviewing the commandos who are in their 90s, as well as sort of the post-war legacy of X Troop, things that have happened about whether or not we call them Jewish, what's happened with the memorials and stuff like that. So to start, I just want to say that part of why I came to write this story was my own family were Jews who served in World War II. My grandfather, Abraham Klein, served in Patton's Third Army, and my uncle Sig and Norbert Lichterman both served in the Pacific. And they were the American Jews who proudly served in World War II and who inspired me to do this. So today I'm going to talk about a largely unknown British commando unit comprised of Jewish refugees from Germany and Austria called X Troop. And it's fine to put the PowerPoint up, whoever is doing that. Thank you. And you can go to the next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to talk about a largely unknown British commando unit comprised of Jewish refugees from Germany and Austria called X Troop, who made a profound difference in the Allied success against the Nazis. And I'll talk later more detailed about how I came to write the book, but I came to it largely philosophically as well as historically, because I wanted to push back very strongly against the anti-Semitic myth about Jewish passivity in the face of the Holocaust that was common after the war. What we know now, of course, is that Jews fought everywhere that they were attacked, in the Warsaw and Lodz ghettos, in the death camps themselves, in the forests, in the cities, in the shtetls, and I must add now, of course, in Israel as well. And my scholarship has been dedicated to including military service in the rubric of how we understand Jewish resistance to the Holocaust. So we have to look at resistance not only in terms of those Jews who died, but also those who valiantly fought back in the military. And that's what my work has focused on. This is my second book in a 3-part series on Jewish service in World War II. So for instance, during World War II, Jewish service in the American Army was disproportionately high. My previous book was about this, called Young Lions. More than 500,000 Jews fought, and they also served in disproportionately high numbers in the Russian and British military as well. So it's important to see, as I argue, that when Jews volunteered to serve, it was because for many of them, this was a specific way to fight back. It was a form of resistance. For the men I'm going to discuss today and the men I write about, the war was personal because Hitler was intent on killing all the Jews. So this meant, as we're going to see in my talk, that they often fought differently from others, such as putting up their hands for all the most dangerous operations. Because for them, the clock was ticking. Every day that the Germans were in power was a day that their family members who were hiding in Germany or France or wherever they were could be killed. And while most armies now have special forces, this was very unusual at the time, and I'm going to tell you about them and show you about how X Troop was this unique story of Jewish resistance. So I'm going to show, there's probably about 8 or 9 slides. It's mostly going to be me talking and taking questions, but this is one of the only group photos of the X-Troop that lasted after the war. But I want to give you the background story of these men first. So we need to go back in time to 1942, when the Third Reich was at the height of its power. All of Western Europe had fallen. Field Marshal Rommel was driving the collapsing British army back towards Alexandria in North Africa, and the Russians were retreating east to Stalingrad. Even though America had entered the war, on the side of the Allies, things were looking bleak. So Winston Churchill was desperate to fight back at the Germans by any means possible. For the past couple of years, they'd been doing commando units, raids on the French coast, but the British were still losing, and they were losing badly. So Lord Mountbatten, who I'm sure most of you have heard about, who was the commander of combined operations, came to Winston Churchill and he made a suggestion. He said that they should create a new special unit of commandos, different from anything that had been used before. The idea with these commandos, and when he said this, Churchill became very interested, was rather than coming from the general ranks of the British military, they would create something called the Inter-Allied 10 Commando Unit. And this would be comprised of soldiers made up of displaced nationals. So there would be a Polish troop in this Inter-Allied 10 Commando, Norwegian troop, French troop, etc. And the idea was that each of these commando units would have their own distinct uniform, but they would be fighting specifically to get the Nazis out of their home countries. And they would all be unified by this shared desire to drive them out. These highly trained, determined individuals would be the tip of the sword when the liberation came. But that was not all that Mountbatten proposed. And now we're going to get to the specific story of the X-Troop. In this inter-allied regiment, there would also be an even more unusual and extraordinary group comprised of German speakers. This group would be given the distinct name of X-Troop. The X-Troop would operate on the front lines of battles and on raids against the Nazis, using their advanced fighting skills to kill and capture the enemy. And before the battle ended, the X-Troopers would interrogate the captured men to get intelligence right then on the battlefield rather than bringing the men back to base. So people often say to me, is the X-Troop similar to the Ritchie Boys? And I say, not really, because the Ritchie Boys were an American German-speaking unit, mostly Jewish, but they only did counterintelligence. The idea of X-Troop was different. They would be commandos who would capture the enemy, and then they would do the counterintelligence on the battlefield. They would capture the Nazis, they would interrogate them right then and there in the heat of battle to get crucial information like where are the mines laid, where's the German machine gun nest, where are the headquarters, etc., what weapons are being used. So the idea was that the intelligence gathered would be used immediately there in the battle itself by these German speakers who could interrogate the Nazis, but also would be the fiercest commandos on the battlefield. So these men had to be a combination of brains and brawn. Counterintelligence is mostly brains, commando is mostly brawn. These men would be both. They would capture the enemy, and then they would interrogate them. And only one group of men would fit this bill because they needed German speakers. They needed highly intelligent, highly motivated German speakers. And of course, the only German speakers we have right now in the UK in 1942 who want to beat the Nazis are Jews. The men who would end up being the X-Troop were all Jewish refugees, all but one, Jewish refugees who had been fleeing to Britain since Hitler's rise to power. And I'm going to talk about their stories in a second. Most of them came completely by themselves to the UK. And while the war was happening, were in the process of losing their parents, their siblings, in some cases their children, to the Nazis. Most, if not all of them, had been raised in loving, mostly middle-class families, where being Jewish was one part of their lives, sometimes minor, sometimes major. And while each of them had a different story about how they came to England, all of them had suffered profound agonies about the destruction of their previous lives. They came to the UK on kindertransport, were smuggled out by partisan groups, were given papers, made their way there. And fortunately, the UK at this point had two programs that helped these men get there. One were the kindertransport, and two was they had a transit program where you come to the UK as long as you went somewhere else. And a lot of Jewish parents realized that at least they could get their kids to the UK, and then maybe, just maybe, there would be somewhere else that they could go. So most of these men who become the X Troop in 1942 come to the United Kingdom by themselves as teenagers or children or young teenagers. So when Churchill makes this decision with Lord Mountbatten that they're going to create this new unit, they had to be able to find the Germans, the German Jews. But at this point in time in 1942, the situation of German Jews in the United Kingdom was very troubling. So I'm going to backtrack a little bit and tell you this part of the story. So next slide, please. So after the war had started, 70,000 UK residents from Germany and Austria had been overnight turned from refugees into enemy aliens. And even though 55,000 of the 70,000 Germans in the UK were actually Jewish, who despised the Nazis, the anti-immigrant press and the government decided that these were potentially a fifth column who could wage war against the British homeland. These were potential enemies who needed to be dealt with. So there was already a tradition of anti-immigrant sentiment, and there was already a fierce anti-Jewish sentiment in the UK, though this wasn't publicly part of the story, but probably privately. So they took up the call, and there was these hysterical reports about this internal menace of Germans. Of course, like I said, most of them are Jewish. So by the spring of 1940, many of the single male Jewish exiles from Germany and Austria who would end up being the X Troop were rounded up and put into detention camps. And this is a picture of the largest detention camp, which was on the Isle of Man. There were some in the UK. They were put behind barbed wire, often put with Nazi POWs. And unfortunately, they were also sent overseas. The worst camps that existed were in Canada and Australia. I actually interviewed a commando, which I'll talk about more later, but one of the men I interviewed to write the book, he was well into his 90s when I interviewed him a couple of years ago, and his voice broke as he described to me how he had been arrested as a German, and he was put on a ship called the Danera to Australia, where the captain was completely anti-Semitic, and he would make the Jewish passengers walk over broken glass and not give them water. It was basically a nightmare in hell. And then all of these guys were sent to these camps in Australia, in Canada, or in the UK for about a year or so. Finally, after about a year that they were in the camps, they were told that they would be allowed out of the internment camps if they would join the military. And the men, of course, thought, that's great, we want to join the military. But unfortunately, next slide, please. The only military that they were allowed to join before this story that I'm going to get to was called the Pioneer Corps. And the Pioneer Corps was manual labor. It was basically comprised of criminals, men who had alcoholic problems, et cetera, like that, men who wanted to serve but weren't trusted to give in arms. Because all of these men were enemy aliens, they were not trusted to be given arms as well. So they all went into the Pioneer Corps. One of the men I'm going to talk about is on the right, Peter Masters, and they just kind of stewed there, desperate, absolutely desperate to get into the fight against the Nazis. Finally, after this meeting in 1942, these signs start appearing in the Pioneer Corps. Now, all of the German Jews ended up in these, they were called E for enemy alien groups within the Pioneer Corps, and signs start appearing on the boards where they're serving that's saying, looking for volunteers for hazardous duty. And all of the men said in their memoirs and their interviews that the most frustrating time of their lives It was terrible to be locked up, but it was even harder in the Pioneer Corps because they were desperate to serve and they were not being trusted to be given arms. Suddenly the sign appears up that says, looking for men volunteering for hazardous duties. And hundreds of these German Jewish and Austrian Jewish men put up their hands and say, I want to be somebody who's going to serve and do this. And these are going to be the men who become the X Troop. They're all sent a train passage to London. And I should add that as I continue, that this story was top secret. So when I wrote the book, I had to sort of declassify all these documents. So most of what I'm sharing today came out with this book because people didn't know the story. So the men are now sent to London who sign up for this, and MI5 interviews each of the men separately in London. Hundreds and hundreds of them sign up, of these German Jewish exiles. And they're told that if they're chosen, they're going to be bringing the fight directly to the Nazis, but these men have nothing to lose. They need to get in the fight because this is personal and they have to beat the Nazis. So they're interviewed by MI5, and they decide to select the best, the brightest, the most athletic, the bravest. They're all asked, why do you want to beat the Nazis? And the men say, one of the men says, they took my dad to Dachau concentration camp. Another says, they've taken my wife and kids and I don't know where they are. They all had personal stories of it. But it wouldn't only be that when they joined the X Troop. Once they were selected for the X Troop, and I'll talk about their training in a second, all of the men were told that they would all have to take on new personas, which is a huge part of this story. So once they're selected for X Troop, about 82 are chosen in sort of the first big wave. They all have to go and they walk into this office with the man who's going to be their commanding officer, who was incredible, and I'll talk about him for a second. And each of them have to go into the office. They have about 5 minutes, and they have to come up with a British-sounding name. They have to come up with a backstory about why they have a German accent. All of them have to wear Church of England dog tags. So if they're killed in battle, they're not being buried under Stars of David. They're going to be buried under crosses. And the reason that they have to do this, and their commanding officer he wasn't Jewish, but he really cared about his men, and he was right about this, was that if any of these men were captured, they would be killed on sight for 3 different reasons. They would be killed if it was discovered they were Jewish. They would be killed if it was discovered that they were German, because they were Germans fighting Germans. And Hitler had done a commando edict to kill commandos on sight. So all of them had to come up with these fake stories. And part of the sort of many of the weirdnesses of writing this book was that when I had to Google their names just to see if there was any history where I could locate people, which I'll talk about later, they all had the most generic names imaginable, like John David or Peter Masters or whatever it was, because they just came up with these names as they walked into the office. And all of them had to go deep undercover, which is also why the story hadn't really been told till I wrote the book, because a lot of the documentation was classified. So each man was given a few minutes to pick a new Anglo-sounding name. Hans Arnstein became Harry Andrews, Werner Goldschmidt became Vernon Dwelly, Stephen Hirsch became Stephen Hudson. They had to destroy every connection they had to the past. They had to get rid of anything that had their names on it. Jewish ritual objects, which some of them brought, because a few of them were Orthodox, were shipped away or hidden away. And they had to sever publicly and with one another, because they didn't want to give away each other's stories if they were captured, their connections to their past. And for many of those killed in battle, this change would remain permanent until this book came out, because they had British names and they were buried under crosses. And part of what's happened since this book has come out is that a number of the men who were buried under these fake names under crosses, I've been working with an organization in the UK that works with Jewish veterans, and we've been reinterring, when the family wants it, the men under Magen David's with a Jewish ceremony. We just did another one recently. So they're finally getting the burial that they deserve. So the men who became X Troop had lost everything of their old lives, including their families for many of them, and they were now being called to transform from philosophy reading, intellectually minded Jewish refugees into Anglo fighters. And so it's sort of ironic that this story of transformation into these warriors was happening because the Germans made them do it, and it would be these Jewish refugees who would end up soundly beating the Germans. So next picture, please. So once the men were selected, they would be working under the great Welshman, Brian Hilton Jones, and he was the commanding officer of the group. And he was so protective of his men's real identities that until the Nazis were defeated, only one man, a secretary at MI5, had access to the list of the men's real names and places of origins. And I was able to see that list, which was quite a moving thing when I was writing about this. So once Brian and the others in MI5 had selected the 80 or so men, next picture, please. Oh, okay, I'll keep going. They were sent over to Wales, because Brian Hilton Jones was Welsh, and he decided he wanted to give these commando men the most intense training that they had ever had in their lives, and he wanted to make them the best commandos in the British unit, and he did. But just to remind ourselves again that it was complicated because the men would be commandos, and they would have to be trained in counterintelligence. So they went to this small town in Wales where because they were officers in the British Army, officers are not billeted in dormitories, they live with locals. So these guys on the train ride, it was so interesting to read their stories or talk to them. On the train ride from London to Wales, it's a pretty long train ride, they had to start memorizing their new names, they were given new uniforms. Some of the men had known each other in the Pioneer Corps, they had to remember each other's names, they had to get to know their backstories. They get to Wales, they're given like $5 or whatever the equivalent was in the day, and told to walk around the Welsh village and offer money to Wales locals to live with them. So they all do that. They end up being billeted with Welsh locals. And just remember how extraordinary this is. All of these men are Holocaust refugees. All of them are suffering profoundly. They're really young, they're 18, 19 years old. They now are in a Welsh village, they're living with Welsh locals, getting used to this form of English, trying to pretend that they're not Jewish, eating the food, and now they start to undertake the training. And the training itself was extraordinary because Brian Hilton Jones wanted them to be the best. They spent days and nights hiking over mountains with full packs and weapons, live ammunition training on assault courses, cliff scaling, demolition work, parachuting, taking apart bombs, night missions. And this is Peter Masters, I'm going to talk about more, but he talked about that he was forced to take apart a Colt 45 blindfolded. And as he said, I never held anything in my life more complicated than a pair of scissors. So this was like a real push for the men. And then at the end of this part of the training, they decided to do sort of a Spartan type training. The men were all dropped off in Scotland with nothing and told they had to make their way to London. Some of them got lost in the woods, they ate grass. One of them stole a motorcycle, he was arrested. They all make their way to London. And so they go through the commando training. At the same time, they also have to go through the counterintelligence training. Some of them are sent to Cambridge, some of them are sent to Oxford. And they have to do all of this while they learn how to do interrogations while living in a Welsh home where everything is new. So after the months of training, all of the men said that it made them confident and it made them feel that they could manage this thing. So all the training basically comes to an end with D-Day. Some of the men are sent to the Italian campaign, but D-Day is now going to be the real test of these men. I think I'm going to take a few breaks as we go along. I assume people will have more questions later, but before I jump into D-Day, do we have any questions from the audience?
We have a few questions, but I think...
But I can wait on them too.
Yeah. Let's wait a little bit because there are only a few. I think people are very focused on the story. Okay,
so
great.
So we get to D-Day. Now, in the days leading up to D-Day, this is another extraordinary part of this story. it becomes clear to the British military that there's no commando unit. In fact, there's no unit in the British military as good as the X troop. And the British military now makes another extraordinary decision, which had not happened before, which was that these guys are too valuable to let them fight as their own unit for a number of reasons. If let's say a bomb goes off and they lose half of them, these guys are going to be so important for the war effort, we cannot risk it. They're also so extraordinary that the military knows that they should spread them out. So in the days leading up to D-Day, they make the decision, the British military at the highest echelons, that unlike the Polish unit or the French unit, who are going to fight as their own commando unit, these guys are too valuable, and they're going to be spread out amongst all the existing commando units to be the leaders of existing commando units. And this is incredible. So they're put into groups of 3s and 4s for the D-Day landings at Sword Beach, because all the other commando units, like 41 Commando and 7 Commando, all these other commando units have been training together for years. They all know each other. And these men are now thrown deep into the thick of it, basically on the walk from Southampton, where they're staying, to the boats. And now they have to fight in D-Day, not with their group anymore, in brand new commando units. But the idea is that they're going to be so crucial to the war effort that we need to do this. Just one other side story before I do the D-Day landings, because it's one of the most of many extraordinary stories that I have to tell. So in the days before the D-Day landings, the British government realizes that these ex-troopers should be used to gather intelligence for the D-Day landings. So one of the men, who is called George Lane, he's actually married to Miriam Rothschild, the famous Rothschild, Miriam Rothschild, who I tell her story in my book as well, who was used at Bletchley Park to do the decodings. That was his wife. He's sent actually to land on the French coast before the D-Day landings to see if he can gather any crucial intelligence, because they've been hearing that there's a different type of mine that the Germans are laying that might make it quite catastrophic to do the D-Day landings. So George Lane is sent on a dinghy 3 times to land on the French coast. When I get to how I got all this sourced, I promise you everything is like triply sourced, as incredible as it sounds, to bring back a mine so that the British military can figure out if they can do the D-Day landings. He finds the mine. It's a normal German mine. There's not a new mine. D-Day will go on as planned. But then the British military sends, we just got to send him one more time. He's sent one last time. He's captured by the Germans. He's sent to a large house that turns out to be the headquarters of Rommel. And one of the stories I tell in the book, I start with the story, is that George Lane is invited to tea with Rommel because Rommel was obsessed with meeting a Brit. And so because George Lane he's actually a Hungarian Jew, he knows that Rommel's going to hear his German accent underneath his fake British accent. So he decides to pretend that he's Welsh, and he does a really weird British accent, and he completely confuses Rommel. Rommel writes to his life and says, I met this really interesting Brit. Of course, Rommel had no idea it was a Hungarian Jewish refugee. And they have a conversation about the treatment of Jews. And the Hungarian Jew is talking about how the British are going to fight to the end for the Jews. Because he's so charming, George Lane, rather than being killed, they lock him up in a POW camp. But as he's being driven away from Rommel's headquarters, he looks under the blindfold and he sees out the corner of his eye what the sort of palace looks like that Rommel, his headquarters, are in. And when he gets to be put in this prisoner of war camp, of course, there's like these sort of secret radio messages that the British have set up for the captured officers. And they get the information back to the United Kingdom. And it's actually George Lane who's able to tell the Brits where Rommel's headquarters is. It's in this very strange particular house in France. And just while all of the D-Day stuff is happening, George Rommel's car gets strafed and he's out of the war forever. And this is because of George Lane. So for Operation Overlord, now, as I said, these men are now put in all these different commando units, and Lord Lovett's in charge of the different commando units. And he does a speech at Southampton, which I just think is so beautiful and important, where he says, in the future, they will say of us that giants must have walked the earth in those days. And the story I'm going to continue to tell you is about these Jewish giants. So for D-Day now, we have the landings themselves, and 43 of the X-troopers are put in with the different commando units to land on Sword Beach. And the idea with the men of X-troop is, first of all, they're going to hide who they are. They're going to pretend that they're British, and that they're going to be the tip of the spear, leading the way into Normandy, going door to door in French villages, capturing Germans, interrogating them, really crucially, doing the nightly patrols across enemy lines to try and gather intelligence, and also persuading, ideally, Germans to surrender with their German, but if not, capturing them. And often injured multiple times, the men of X-Troop would frequently simply walk out of field hospitals and return to their units to continue their own personal war against the Nazis. So let me tell you about Peter Masters now. So this is Lieutenant Peter Masters. Originally, his name was Peter Arony, and he was from a Viennese middle-class Jewish family. He was an artist, and I'll get to that later, why that's important, but he had a photographic memory, which is really important. So when he would encounter things on secret patrols, he could draw sketches of them. And as he said of the X-troopers, when all the other men in the commando units would draw straws to see who didn't have to do the most dangerous missions, all of the X-troopers were drawing straws to see who got to do the most dangerous missions, including Peter Masters, who before the war was this very sensitive Jewish artist. So next slide, please. So on D-Day, when he's in Southampton and all the men have been put in these different troops, he's walking down to the dock at Southampton, and one of the guys comes up to him and says to him, "Hey, would you like to be part of the bicycle troop?" And he says, "Sure, I used to ride a bicycle." He doesn't say it's in Vienna, but I used to ride a bicycle. And so one of the many strange aspects of this story is that the British military decided that one of the crucial groups that would land at Sword Beach would be called the bicycle troop. And you can see in the back of the picture, they're carrying one of the bikes. And the idea was that when the men landed at Sword Beach, they would ride their bikes ahead of everybody else, and they would get to Pegasus Bridge, which I'm sure the audience knows was this crucial thing that had to be taken so that the Germans could not advance further. So the bicycle troop, like I said, had been training together for a year. Peter Masters gets thrust into this group with a couple of other ex-troopers. And what he quickly finds is that, as he says, there's nothing worse to land at D-Day with than a 50-pound bicycle. It was a terrible idea. But the idea was that they would ride their bikes ahead. They were foldable. He said when you put your backpack on, it kept making it break. But he and the others make their way forwards. And the idea was, like I said, to get to Pegasus Bridge. So Peter Masters, I don't know if people have seen the movie The Longest Day about Major John Howard on the famous Pegasus Bridge. But the truth of the matter is, that was actually our Viennese Jewish guy, Peter Masters, riding his bike over Pegasus Bridge, who's the first to get over Pegasus Bridge. So he leads the way, this guy, because he knew, like I said, that the war was personal and he had to beat the Germans. And his story is not alone. All these stories are kind of part of the natural history of what happens when they land at D-Day. Another guy I'm going to talk about later called Manfred Gans, and I'll tell a lot more about him. He comes from an Orthodox Jewish family, and he does it at Sword Beach exactly what you're supposed to do. When you land at Sword Beach, if you're part of the X-troop, like I said, you're supposed to capture the enemy and interrogate them. He lands with his commando unit at Sword Beach, and immediately, because they arrive a little bit late, they're wiped out. The commando unit he's with is wiped out, except for like a remnant group of them. Manfred Gans takes the lead, because that's the job of the X-troopers, And he says to the men who are still living, come on, boys, we have to get off the beach, because he knows you can't stay on the beach. As he starts to go up the dunes of the beach, he runs into 20 Germans with machine guns. It's a machine gun nest. Montfort calls out in idiomatic German, boys, you need to give up now and show me where the mines are off the beach. The Germans are so shocked to see this British commando speak in fluent idiomatic German with such authority that they give up. This is exactly what you're supposed to do if you're an ex-trooper. He gathers their weapons and he gets one of them to lead the rest of the men safely off the beach. That's exactly the idea for what the ex-troop does. So as the ex-troop makes their way forward, oh, there's questions now. Okay, good. I'll take some questions and I'll keep going.
I just wanted to let you know now I have plenty. Whenever the next natural stopping point is. Do you want to stop now? Okay.
This is good, because now I'm going to tell you about the rest of the war and then post-war.
Okay, great. All right, so I'll save the post-war questions then for later. So one person asked for clarification. Were you saying or implying that the units that they were embedded in, they didn't know who they
didn't know who they were.
Okay.
And they weren't allowed to know. And Brits tend to be very sort of low-key and polite. So most of them said they weren't asked. They just sort of like lived with the fact that these guys had these accents. And there was a really funny story about in the Welsh town. The Welsh villagers didn't know either. And I and others interviewed a bunch of the Welsh villagers after the war to say, what about all these guys with these German accents? And one of them said, yeah, we used to laugh because they would always say, "We are English." Like, so everyone sort of knew something was going on, but that wasn't a thing that they actually really had to deal with. They did say, though, some of the men said, and I think this was true, that they were often pushed much harder and had to prove themselves twice as much because the other commandos kind of sussed it out that these guys were Jewish German guys. And they were, but I think truthfully, they wanted to prove themselves more, but they did know that they were the outsiders and they were treated as outsiders.
So maybe there was sort of a don't ask, don't tell aspect
totally.
to, okay.
Yeah, yep.
Okay, great.
It sensed that there was bad feelings towards them, but overall it was sort of ignored, don't ask, don't tell, because these guys immediately jumped into these leadership roles. And I think the other commandos were very grateful that these guys were always putting up their hands to do incredibly dangerous stuff that nobody wants to have to do that, but these guys wanted to do it. So,
Right.
And what I'll say later too is that they ended up getting like a huge number of military medals and citations for bravery.
Thank you. A handful of people asked about the movie Inglourious Bastards, and I can't remember if you mentioned it in passing or not. I don't think you did, but
No,
if there.
The men did a lot of letters to each other about Inglourious Bastards. They hated it. Peter Masters, whose picture I showed there, his daughter is Kim Masters, who I became friends with when I wrote this. She's a reporter for the Hollywood Reporter. You can Google. She wrote a really good essay about why the real Inglourious Bastards, the reason that they hated the movie was all of the men said that the men of X-Troop fought with the highest ethics, with high Jewish ethics, and they thought Inglourious Bastards focused too much on revenge, and they all said this was about showing to the world that we were better than the Germans. We would follow the rules twice as much as anyone else did. So they were really proud of that fact, and they felt Inglourious Bastards just sort of turned them into this like revenge machine.
That makes sense. So maybe just one more question.
But I love Tarantino now because of his pro-Israel stuff, so don't tell him I said that.
Okay. So maybe just one more question for now, but a few people asked about why did this remain classified for so long? It would seem that right after the war, we don't need to protect their identities in the same way.
So I'll talk about.
And it's sort of made for a Hollywood movie.
Yeah, I'll talk about more that later, but part of what I'm going to end up saying is that a lot of it was sort of self-inflicted quietness, because after the war, all the men were Holocaust survivors and they were so traumatized by it that I'll get to this later, but the majority of them kept their fake names. Many of them never told their kids that they were Jewish. And I think that it was a protective mechanism. The way that when people go to Israel, many of them change their names to this stronger vision of themselves. The men sort of embrace, most of the men, the American ones who came to America, it was different, but the ones who stayed in the UK, most of them kind of embraced it, so there was no push to declassify this story. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so now I'm going to tell you about the rest of the war, and then I will tell you about post-war. So if we can go back to the slides. I'm not seeing them, but maybe. Okay, okay, yeah, this picture. So they lead the troops through D-Day, phenomenally successful. And the next big battle, for those of you who know the history, we know is the Battle of the Bulge. And it's actually ex-troopers who make the British successful in the Battle of the Bulge. It was sort of the final effort of Hitler. And Hitler realized that, that Antwerp was a really crucial port that they had to get to be successful. And the Americans realized this as well, that the Americans needed the Antwerp port in order to rearm themselves. They couldn't be successful without another port. So between Antwerp and where the British were advancing was this little island called Walcheren. And I just wanted to speak very briefly about it. So Montfort Gans, who I'm going to talk about more later, and another number of the commandos were sent to do the invasion of Walcheren, which was an insanely, so fortified island by the Germans. And it's the ex-troopers who end up leading the way on the invasion. And I just want to show you this picture because on the right is an ex-trooper. His real name is Maurice Latimer. He was a Jew from the Sudetenland, and he had single-handedly captured that tower that you see behind him. And that was the main German position that was being held on Walcheren. And he's bringing out the Germans he's captured. And part of why I like this photo so much, and part of why the ex-troopers always like this photo so much, is because we all know the traditional and horrific photo of the Jewish boy with his hands up, being led by the Germans. And now we have this glorious photo of a Jewish member of the British Army who's now leading the Germans away with their hands up. So I think that this is like the most paradigmatic sort of a picture of what the ex-troop were about. So the men make their way through, they're crucial for the Battle of the Bulge, and then they keep going forward, and now we get to the crossing of the Rhine as they're going over to go into Germany itself. And you can do the next picture. So this is a Jeep with one of my favorite of the commandos. You can see him sitting there as you're facing at the front left. His name is Ian Harris. And when Ian Harris crossed over the river and gets over there, he decides that he's had enough of this because he's also, of course, suffering because family members are dying every day. And he makes his way and he goes and he finds a garrison of Germans in Osnabrück in Germany. And he ends up capturing the entire garrison by himself by talking the guy out, the German guy who's in charge of them, into doing a shooting contest. This is all true. And he outshoots the other guy and they give up. And it's filmed for the military. There's actually a video of him capturing all the troops. Again, no one realizing that this guy is a Jew who's done this whole thing and had been crucial in capturing the war. So the last story I want to tell you about before I tell you about the post-war stuff is actually, of all these extraordinary stories, one of the most extraordinary story. Next photo, please. About Montfort Gans, who I've mentioned a bunch of times earlier. Captain Fred Gray, the fake name he took was Fred Gray. Montfort Gans was raised in an Orthodox Jewish family, which was unusual. Most of the families were quite secular. And he was put into counterintelligence training. He went to Cambridge. He was brilliant. He'd been like a superhero throughout the war. I talked to you about Lord Sword Beach, where he got all the guys to give up. He ends up taking a really crucial radar station in Normandy. He's constantly asked to leave the battleground to do officer training because he's so extraordinary. And he refuses because he wants to be there. Because while the war is happening, he gets 2 letters from the Red Cross. The first horrific, not sure why that happened. So the first horrific letter that he gets from the Red Cross is that his parents who have been hiding have been told on, and they've been put in Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. And he writes a letter, which I read, and I have a copy of, where he says, these Germans, and I'm going to rescue my parents. The war continues. He's completely heroic, won't leave the battlefield. Finally, he's brought into sort of an office by his commanding officer, who says, man, what's the real story with you? And he finally tells someone the real story. So now his commanding officers know who he is, but he says, I'm still not going to leave. I'm only going to take a battlefield commission, which the British military does not do battlefield commissions. You have to be sent to officer training school. They agree because he's so extraordinary. So in the final days of the war, he gets another letter from the Red Cross that his parents have now been moved to Theresienstadt concentration camp in the former Czechoslovakia. And he says to himself, I'm going to get them. So before the war is even ended, in the final days of the war, he goes to his commanding officer and he says, I need to go find my parents. And the commanding officer knows that this guy's a complete superhero, and he knows his story, and he says to him, all right, I'm going to give you a Jeep, and I'm going to give you a driver, and best of luck to you. And Manfred Ganz knows in the moment how extraordinary this is. So he starts to keep a diary of it that's held in the Holocaust Museum. And in writing this book, I became very close with his family, and I talked to them almost weekly. And he decides to keep a diary because he knows this is going to be extraordinarily important for history. So for the next couple of days, Manfred Ganz drives in a terrible Jeep with no brakes through Germany, where the war is just ending. And he deals with a dystopic, horrific landscape, as you can imagine. There's abandoned vehicles, there's soldiers wandering around. Unfortunately, whenever he picks up POWs to kind of give him a ride further, not only are they starving, but they always say to him, you should see what they did to the Jews. So his heart is starting to drop inside of himself as he makes his way. He's the first Brit that the Russians see as he makes his way across the Russian lines. Part of why he does it is one of them recognizes that he's Jewish and says Yid, and he says Yid, and then they let him through. Finally, he arrives at Terezin concentration camp in Czechoslovakia. The SS guards had gone like hours before. The Russians had just arrived there, and he writes about all this in his diary, and I quote it in my book. And I actually the main reason people should get the book, I think, is to read his story. I don't want to go into the details of it because you can read what he writes about it, but suffice it to say, he goes into the concentration camp, and he goes to the desk, and as we all know about the Germans, that they're fastidious in keeping their records. And there's a Jewish girl behind the desk. The Germans are gone, but cholera is in the camp. It's as we all know, the stuff of complete nightmares, what you expect. I won't go into the details of it, but he finds out from the Jewish girl behind the desk when he says the name of his parents, that she breaks into tears and she starts crying hysterically. And she says, they're here. They had survived the epidemics and they're here. And so what I tell you in the book is the story of their reunion, and in his own words, because he writes it all down as it's happening. And so you should read that, and he rescues them. And if you do the next page, you can see Manfred with his two brothers and his parents in Israel in the 1950s. So it's one of the most extraordinary things of the many extraordinary stories of the war. So now I want to go to the post-war stuff, unless there's any breaking questions, because there's a lot of important post-war stuff.
I think you can go ahead and go to the post-war. Thanks.
All right, so when the war, and so we can go back to the slides, just because it's so nice to see the picture of Manfred with his parents. So when the war in Europe ends in May 1945, the X-Troop starts to take stock of its disproportionately high casualties. Of the 87 men who'd been in the unit at the beginning of D-Day, 20 men were killed in action or were missing, presumed dead, and 24 were seriously wounded. But of the survivors, an extraordinary 18 members of X-Troop received battlefield commissions, which was one of the highest rates of any Allied unit in the Second World War. But now as we get to the point where British soldiers are being demobbed, ex-troopers are told that they're going to be this is going to, I think, blow the audience away as well. Now they're going to be the leaders in the denazification efforts. So they're going to be, the ex-troopers are going to be the ones who will help to hunt down and capture Nazis and members of the Gestapo. They're going to be the ones who will gather information for the war trials. They're going to be the one, particularly Montfort Gons, who are going to interrogate high-ranking officials. So they're going to be in charge of the denazification efforts, this group. And of course, it makes sense. And part of the extraordinary story of the X-Troop is in that denazification era, like Montfort had grown up in this town in Germany. Like I said, he was Orthodox, called Borken, Germany. And when the Nazis rose to power, he suffered. He suffered cruel treatment in his school. So after the war ends, he is told, and this happens to all the ex-troopers, you're going to be in charge of denazifying your town. So he goes back to Borken, and Montfort knows who the anti-Semitic teachers are, but he also knows who hid the Jews. So he's in charge of the denazification efforts of his own town. The level of agency these men get back is extraordinary. Other men who are put in charge of other towns make the decision that they won't give any of the food rations to Germans until they watch the horrific videos of the extermination camps. All of them knew what the real story was, and they had to get the information out. And I forgot to mention this, when Montfort Gons did that epic crossing of Germany, where he kept running into people, he said the most scary of all of them were the German civilians who just, they knew in their hearts how important the denazification efforts were. But they weren't only there because of that. The British military treated them quite strangely after the war, and this is part of why the story was so secretive. While the other members of the commando, Inter-Allied 10 Commando unit, like the Polish troop and the French troop, were given the option to be naturalized after the war. Unfortunately, the X-Troop was not naturalized. So from 1945 until about 1948, but this is the point at which they're also they're leading the denazification efforts, these guys are still enemy aliens. And so I did a deep dive into all the archival material to figure out what was going on here, because I knew that the commando units were talking about their extraordinary bravery. So I knew this wasn't coming from the commando units. And I knew this wasn't coming from the military, who actually deeply appreciated this men. It turned out that in the War Office in London, there was this one bureaucrat who was in charge of naturalizing the commando men. And he was obviously completely anti-Semitic. And he would not let these men be naturalized. So finally, in 1948, Brian Hilton Jones, who's their commanding officer, has been desperately begging the War Office to give these guys naturalization papers. And he's not being listened to. They go to Parliament. And then finally, all the sort of heads of the commando units go to the War Office, and they say this to this guy, you're not in charge anymore. These guys have to be naturalized. They were the most brave men of the war. So finally, in 1948, the men are let out of the British military. They're given naturalization papers at this point in 1948. And just to sort of reiterate, where other men in the British military get to go home to their towns or their wives or whatever it is, these guys have nothing. They have no home to go to. So what happens after 1945 is that many of the men immigrate to the United States. And for those who immigrate to the United States, who I'll talk about in a second, like Montfort Gons, Peter Masters as well, the bicycle troop guy, they raise their kids as Jewish. They tell their kids the stories. for those who stay in the UK, the majority of them, as I said, don't tell their kids their stories. They're fearful. They, as one of the children tell me, they want to be more British than the British. The audience probably doesn't realize this, but after the war, there was a rise of fascism in the UK. The fascist party, Mosley's party, came back and was quite strong in the 1950s. So they were nervous. And before the war, Britain did not have a great reputation for its treatment of the Jews. So there wasn't a sense that they could be sort of British Jewish. They had to be one or the other. So it's after the war that these men started spreading out into different places. Montfort Gans, who you see here, before the war, he wanted to be a chemist. He was desperate to be a chemist. And after the war, he comes to the United States. He goes to MIT, of course, because he's completely brilliant. He studies chemistry. He's the head of his synagogue, like has a very rich, rewarding, and wonderful life. Peter Masters, who I showed you earlier from the bicycle troupe, he ends up coming to the United States and gets the first Fulbright in art to the United States and goes to Yale. So these guys all become leaders of their worlds. I just want to tell you one more anecdotal story before I tell you the post-war legacy. I think there's one more photo. I'm not sure if oh no, okay, so that's okay. You can get rid of the PowerPoint now, and I'll just talk a bit more about stuff, thank you. So just one sort of beautiful anecdote that I told at the War College recently, and then I want to tell you about sort of like their post-war legacy and how I wrote the book and take questions, was that Ian Harris, who I showed you earlier, leading the garrison of Nazis in his Jeep, after that moment, he ends up fighting the Hitler Jugend in Germany. He loses his eye. He gets a military medal. I read his citation. It said basically, I've never encountered such a brave man as Ian Harris. Ian Harris goes back to the UK. He raises his kids, who I became pretty close with when I wrote this book. And when I was writing the book, I went to meet their family, and their son showed me his medals and stuff like that. And he said, I want to tell you one last story about my dad, Ian Harris, which will be my final story. And then I'll tell you some other post-war stuff. And I said, yeah, tell me about your dad, Ian Harris. And he said, well, when my dad died, he was like 92 years old. And he knew that he would have a military ceremony. But he said to me, Mark, you need to do something at my ceremony that's very out of the ordinary. And I want you to do this for me. And so his son, Mark, said, okay, I'm gonna do whatever you want of me. I love you, Dad. This sounds good. Let's do it. So he has this full military ceremony when he dies. It's covered in all the press because he was so heroic through the war. And just after they do the bugle and they are wrapping it all up, Mark does what he promised his dad he would do. He stands up, turns to the audience and says, up yours, Adolf, which I thought was so great. So that's sort of the moment it ends with the ex-trooper. So if I have any questions, I want to tell you about how I wrote the book and sort of the post-war legacy, unless there's any questions before I do that, and why I wrote this book.
That was definitely one of the questions. Hold on, let me just check. The truth is, most of the questions you've actually addressed or are about the post-war legacy, so I'll continue to hold them.
All right, so I'll talk about why I wrote it in the post-war legacy. So I knew I wanted to write a book about World War II, and then what ended up happening was that I started to hear these rumors. I think because of Inglourious Basterds kind of brought up the rumors as well, that there was this secret commando unit of Jewish guys in the British military, and I wanted to know more about them. And what ended up happening, so I'm going to tell you the process of writing the book and sort of the post-war legacy now, this was the year, so this is in the like 6 months before COVID hits, right? So I somehow managed to first reach out to Peter Masters' family, the bicycle troupe guy, and his wife still lives outside of DC, and I go and I have this incredible day with his family where I see all the material that his family's collected. And it turns out that he had donated a lot of stuff to the Holocaust Museum, as well as the World War II Museum in New Orleans. So I start to make connections with these places. And I start to then make connections with the children of the ex-troopers. And what's ended up happening with this book is now we're all in a big email trail together, and everyone's been reunited, and it's been beautiful. Because what I knew was really important is when you tell the stories of World War II and the Holocaust, as we all know, that interviews are not completely trustworthy because people tell you different things. And what had ended up happening with the ex-troopers, in the 1980s, they were interviewed by this great military historian who ended up being very kind to me when I wrote the book. He interviewed all the men he could find in the 1980s, and he put all their interviews in the Imperial War Museum in the UK, where I also went and did a bunch of research. So I'm talking to the family members, I'm listening to all the interviews they did in the 80s, and I kept thinking, this is like, every story is more extraordinary than the story before. Can this really all be true? And so one of the great things about the British military is they keep deep archival material called war diaries. So for every battle that happens in World War II, there's these things called war diaries, where it's just like these accounts in great detail of every moment of the war, every battlefield, every commando unit. So the way I ended up writing the story was I had all the interviews that the men had done in the Imperial War Museum. I started to get in touch with all the children of the ex-troopers and started to interview them and find out that they all have these amazing archives in their families that I get to go through. And then I go through the war diaries and fact check everything to see, were they really this amazing? And hello, audience, they were that amazing and more. None of it was hyperbolic. All of it was true. Everything that they said they did, they did. I have like 3 accounts for every story that was told. But also while I'm writing the book, I find out that there's actually commandos still alive. So I started to, I was able to interview 2 of the commandos who were still alive as I wrote the book. One of the commandos had never told anyone. This guy was amazing, but when I interviewed him, I think he was 94, never had told anyone he was Jewish, never had told anyone he was German. He completely embraced the British commando story that he had lived with since he was like 18. I flew out to California and I interviewed him. He asked me not to put his real name in the book. And I did a formal interview for the Holocaust Museum. We can give his real name in a couple of years. And I realized as he was talking to me that I was the first person he had told his story to. And he told me about how his parents disappeared without a trace. It was just terrible. But I think also for him, very important to tell his story. And he died a few months after I interviewed him. So I was able to interview commandos as well, because I thought it was really important that I did all these different networks to tell the story. One last thing I want to tell before I do questions and my voice is cutting out is about the legacy. It's very complicated about the ex-troop, but it has a nice ending, I think. In the 1990s, the ex-troopers who were still in the UK decided that it would be really important to have a memorial, of course, to this incredible unit, and that they would put the memorial in the town in Wales where they trained. Unfortunately, in my opinion, the person who was put in charge of the memorial was this guy called, his fake name was Brian Greene. He was a judge in the UK. He had never told anyone he was Jewish. And so there was about 6 months in which the ex-troopers had a real kind of battle about what would go on this big, beautiful memorial in their training town. And unfortunately, on the memorial, there's no mention that they were Jewish, none whatsoever. So the memorial is still there up, and it says about the men of X-Troop with no mention that they're Jewish. But there's been a Jewish war veteran who's made it one of his missions over the last many years to get the Jewish story out there, like with the public in the UK about the X-Troop. So now whenever people go to Wales who are Jewish, they bring little Magen Davids and they put it down at the base of the memorial so that we know the true history of these people. But the people who were fighting to have the word Jewish on it were Montford Gons and Peter Masters, who I focus much of my book on. So just a last sort of anecdote before we do questions. A couple of months ago, I got an email from a local guy in the town of Harlech, Wales, where the men also trained. He'd read the X-Troop book. And he said, look, I want to put up a memorial in Harlech in Wales to the X-Troop. And I said, oh my God, that's fabulous. So we worked together on the plaque, and I made it very prominent that the plaque says Jewish Commandos. And 2 weekends ago, they had this it was covered by the BBC, it's been all over the press. A memorial to the X-Troop is now finally up as of 2 weeks in Wales that talks about the X-Troopers as a Jewish commando unit. And their kids agreed to it, and sort of like, I was quite determined that I felt this battle was really important to fight, and it's had a nice outcome. And so there you go. I will take questions now because I'm running out of my voice. Or comments too. I would love comments.
Thank you so much. You should definitely have a drink. It's incredibly moving, and thank you so much, not only for teaching us today, but for all of this incredible research that you did and putting it together in a book. And I'm so glad that the book has received so much attention. So there's one of our folks here heard you speak shortly after the book came out, which I think was a little over 2 years ago now, if I'm correct, and was asking if you just told us the story that you closed with clearly speaks to the impact of the book and your work in terms of broadening recognition. But the person was asking if any more, if there has been any other kind of impact in the last couple of years since the book came out in terms of descendants having a fuller understanding of what their fathers and grandfathers did, or other kinds of recognition or response that that you haven't told us about yet.
Yeah. So much has been happening. So this talk I gave at the War College, I think was, for me, it felt really important. It was just about a month ago. And so this was it was amazing. It was quite top secret. It was at the Carlisle War Barracks, and the American military brought me in to do a lecture with all the major military leaders from around the world to talk about X-Troop, because they wanted to put that story as part of the American military narrative, and also in terms of how to fight effectively. And as of a few months ago, the British military now officially is doing all this recognition of X-Troop at all their trainings and stuff. So that was really important to me, that it made its way into the military as well. It was really interesting to write the book because often when I would meet with families and tell them about their fathers, particularly the British Jewish families, I ended up knowing more about their fathers than they knew, which was really moving and strange. I talk about this moment when I was writing the book, where I went, this was before lockdown, where I went to interview one of the children of one of the commandos, who's on the cover photo of the hardback version of the book. And his son was in the military, and his grandsons are in the military, the British military. And we're sitting at a pub outside of London, and I said to him what I say to everybody when I interview them was, do you know what happened to your grandparents, the parents of his dad? And I'm sitting with this really tough British guy, and he just starts weeping with me because he had never talked about it. And he tells me how his parents had been put in the lodge ghetto and no one had ever heard from them again. And so part of, it's been sort of this trickle of these stories that are continuing to come out. We've also been quite successful, particularly recently, with getting commandos moved under their proper Jewish names if the family wants it, and Magen David. So that continues to be happening. So watch The Hollywood Reporter, because there's going to be an incredibly, insanely huge announcement about the X-Troop in the next month or two, in terms of it having been optioned, and big stuff's going to happen there, film-wise and TV-wise, with names that I still can't believe are interested in it. But I have to say that since October 7th, I have felt, and I think many people who read the book have felt, it's really crucial that this story is told about Jews fighting back. Honestly, like I was talking to Manfred's son last week, and I said to him, I think about your dad all the time, and that this idea of being passive in the face of evil, I don't think works. And I think that for those of us like myself who support Israel, one of my happiest moments was when the book came out in Hebrew recently, because I think that we forget when we think about Jewish resistance that the men who served in the military were doing Jewish resistance. And it's a much bigger story than we remember it is. So it's been interesting with X Troop because it's been like the little engine that could, like the BBC just did a podcast with Helena Bonham Carter on the X Troop. Like it just keeps going like as this, and people always say to me, God, I didn't know about this story. And I always think to myself, I'm so grateful you do now, because these men were giants and they would have done anything possible to save the Jews. But so everyone was feeling that way who was Jewish, but they actually succeeded at it, which is part of the craziness of the story, that they wanted to do it and they were successful at doing it. So it's weird, the press coverage just keeps continuing. It's very nice, but particularly for the family of the ex-troopers. Like when they did that BBC thing a couple of weeks ago about the ceremony in Wales, the family was just so excited, particularly the British families, as the story keeps getting out there.
That's amazing. Okay, so more questions about these folks and their families. One person asked if there was anyone who, you talked especially about those who stayed in Britain and not making a big deal about their Jewishness. Someone asked, were there any descendants who actually didn't know that they were Jewish and kind of learned that in the course of your being in contact with them, or it didn't go quite that far?
Yeah, it was so like, like one of the kids told me that he had no idea he was Jewish till he got invited to a bar mitzvah of a cousin. And he was like, what? What is that about that I'm getting invited to a bar mitzvah of a cousin? I mean, the book has churned up some stuff. I don't normally tell the story, but I'll tell the JTS community the story. But, this thing about turning the crosses to Stars of David was contentious with a few families because they have been living undercover since 1945. And if that's what they want to do, that's obviously their decision to do that. But when the book came out, I got contacted by two sons of an ex-trooper. I thought this was so interesting. One son had remained in the UK, right? And this was a family that we've been trying to get the cross changed to Star of David for. The son who remained in the UK was really angry about the book because he said, look, I think he felt, I don't know, that this was like a secret, like whatever, and that they didn't want him to be under a Star of David. And, they were comfortable with this. But then I get a letter from his brother who's moved to California saying, Leah, thank you so much for telling the story, because this is the story that a number of us in the family wanted to be told. So it's very complicated. It's even when we did that memorial in Wales a few weeks ago, I did get a letter from one of the grandchildren of an ex-trooper being like, you sure you want to say Jewish on it? These are not safe times. And I thought, wow, many of the feelings of fear, unfortunately, particularly in the British environment, I think are still there for a number of the families. Some of them have embraced it, but it's not been an easy road for them. And I think the truth of the matter is with their parents, particularly the men who stayed in the UK, I think the men were the best men in the world. I think they were still in close proximity to Germany. There was a post-war rise of fascism in the UK. There was all that anti-Semitism. I can't feel anything but respect for the decisions they made. But I think that their children felt confused some of the children felt confused when the book came out, because, like I said, they were hearing these stories. They knew their dads were heroes, but they never sort of knew. I think they knew less about the sort of emotional journey that their fathers went through. And just to remember again, these were kids. They were like 19 years old. they'd lost everything they had, and now they were asked to be these warriors, and they rose to the occasion times 10. But it was a very complicated thing. But all of the men in the interviews that were conducted in the 80s and the interviews I did, all of them said, like, the greatest thing that ever happened in their lives was the fact that the British military trusted them enough to give them arms and to fight the Nazis. So they were upset that they had been interred, and they did not like that, obviously. But I think what they felt more than anything was gratitude that they got to go fight the Nazis one-on-one and capture and kill Hitler-Jugend. Like, who wouldn't want to do that? And these men got to do that. So it's a really complicated legacy. Yeah. And I have to say, it continues to be complicated.
Right. So not that we need more evidence of heroism, but you talked about the, some of them being involved in denazification efforts, even in their own hometowns. Someone asked if any of them became involved in Nazi hunting after the war.
Yes, they did. Yeah, I tell those stories. It's it's crazy. Like, yeah, they did Nazi hunting. These men, they were given 3 jobs after the war. Some of them were given the job of literally Nazi hunting. I tell their stories, like given revolvers. One of them told the story of being told that there were Nazis hiding in an asylum and having to interview everyone and figuring out who the Nazis were. And then he goes and he chases them with his gun and fire, like they're shooting at each other. Crazy stuff, all true. So some of them were given the job of literally Nazi hunting. A number of them were given the job of compiling information for the Nuremberg trials, like going through all the information to get the information for the Nuremberg trials. And then a number of them, like those who were the best interrogators, like Montfort, were given the job of interrogating the high-ranking Nazi officials for the trials.
I want to just ask you about, your own experience, and I'll share with you and other folks. Every time we do a new series, we sort of, we were playing with different titles, and obviously we have so many alumni who doing wonderful work who we could have reached out to, and one of our operating or kind of our motivations in this series and the alumni that we decided to reach out to was kind of JTS alumni changing the world, and we ended up not going with that title. But this is a book of where you've done and compiled and shared scholarly research, but with so much impact in terms of uncovering a legacy that it's really important for everyone to know about. And the question that someone asked was, you've written several other books before and many articles. Did it kind of play a different role for you? Has it felt different for you? Does it kind of hold a special place in terms of your own scholarly legacy?
God, I got a chill when you asked me that. No one's ever asked me that. That's such a good question. Oh my God, when the book came out, when I sent in the final draft, I think it was to HarperCollins. The press is, I had a press in the United States, which was HarperCollins, and then in the UK it was Penguin. I think it was when I sent it to the New York press. So I had been really lucky because right before COVID, I took my phone to all the archives and I took thousands and thousands of photos of everything. And so the Holocaust Museum shut down, Imperial War, everything shut down, but I had everything on my phone, thank God. And so the museums allowed me to use my phone photos for the book. So a lot of those are just me taking photos with my phone. And so I was able to do all the research. Everything shuts down, but I'd finished all the research. So now I'm sitting here writing the book. We're under lockdown. We had to take our family out of the city. My family lived in this Jewish socialist community in Peekskill. We went and lived in this cabin with 2 teenage girls. It was hell on earth, as I'm sure it was for everybody. And I remember I sent in the final version of the book during these awful days. And there was no privacy because we're in a teeny little space together. I went and sat in my car And I just started crying and crying and crying. And I was like, Leah, what's going on? And I realized that I was mourning because I'd been living with Montfort Gons and Peter Masters and these guys for 2 years. I knew all their family members. And I was deeply in love, not in love, but loved them deeply. And I remember this sense of like feeling I had to let go of it. And it's been weird because I thought it would end there, but it keeps going. The X Troop just keeps going. Like I'm still in touch with everybody, but it impacted me in a way that like it has been one of the deepest honors of my entire life that I got to tell the story. It's completely different from anything I've ever done. And the sense of gratitude I feel that I was the one who these people trusted to tell the story. It's also changed how I view the world. When the book came out, you know, I was asked to write like editorials for like, I can't remember, like CNN or Time magazine, all these things. Like, what is the story of like, how did it impact you? And I remember at that point, I was like, embrace our refugees, all that kind of stuff. Now I'm like, since October 7th, the story of the X Troop has taught me about fighting back. Like I've been doing at Hunter since October 7th is fight. And I feel that these men have inspired that. And if I hadn't written that book, I don't know if I would have felt the courage to try and do that in this October 7th world.
I don't think I want to ask any other questions after that, because that's, I mean, just an incredibly moving way to close this powerful presentation. And I guess in that, maybe I'll just, since we have one more minute, in that context, has it felt, I know you're already working on a new project, is it sort of strange to kind of resume regular research?
Completely strange. I'm writing a new book about the Pacific Campaign in World War II. But the thing is that I sort of see and talk to the X Troop family so much that they've kind of become like family, I would say, in some senses. I don't know if they would agree to that, but I think they would. So it's sort of like X Troop still lives in my home 100%. And I thought that moment when I was crying, I was letting go, not happening. So it's sort of like X Troop's here, and then I'm also doing this other stuff as well.
We are so grateful to you. Someone just wrote in the chat to me why truth matters. So can't say it better than that. Thank you so much for doing the work and for sharing it with us today. And it's just JTS is I'm sure I wasn't speaking for JTS at the time when you were a student, but I think I can speak for JTS now in saying how proud the institution is of you and your work and your impact. So thank you so much. And we will definitely keep our eyes and ears peeled for the next, news of further exposure of your work. So thank you.
Thank you. Can I just say thank you again, JTS, because all of this happened because I was a PhD student at JTS, a powerful and awesome school with, like, in my generation, the best of the teachers. So thank you, JTS. I always say thank you, JTS, but thank you, JTS.
Thank you. We want to thank everyone for joining us today. And oops, I just closed the document by accident, but so I'm missing the name of it now, but I want to invite folks back for next week. Our session next week is featuring Rabbi Jason Rubenstein and Dr. Michael Kay, who are alumni of two other JTS programs. They will be speaking about, actually a segue from what Dr. Garrett just mentioned, anti-Semitism on campus. Jason Rubenstein is the new director of Harvard Hillel. Michael Kay is the head of school of a Jewish high school, and they'll be talking about kind of preparing Jewish kids for campus these days, and then kind of life leading Jewish community on campus. So that is next week. I'm sorry, I don't have the name. Oh, here it is. Zionism and Anti-Semitism on Campus and Beyond. So we hope you'll join us next week as well. And thanks once again to Dr. Garrett for an incredibly moving and important presentation today.
Thank you, everyone.